Hi guys, so let's now take a look at another D1 essay. This time we've got a transport and environment question for pre-U economics. So this one is from 2016. Environmental taxes are always the best way to solve the environmental problems caused by transport. To what extent do you agree with this view? So, of course, 40-mark question. This one received 36 out of 40. It's a brilliant essay. The structure, again, as we've seen with the China one previously, is excellent. It breaks down the essay into four to five key areas, which are really analysed in a lot of detail. So you can see that structure is very, very strong. Let's take a look then. Okay, so here we go. Emissions are one of the biggest environmental problems caused by transport. Transport emissions make up 21% of total emissions, and this figure has increased by 6% since 1990. The impact of emissions are twofold. The CO2 emissions lead to climate change, the warming of the earth, and the particulate matter leads to a negative impact on public health. In fact, it is believed that there are 40,000 premature deaths in the UK due to poor air quality. Emissions are not the only environmental problem facing the UK. Congestion is estimated to cost the UK £4.3 billion in terms of both user and environmental costs. Sustainability and efficiency issues in terms of transport are also facing the UK today. Environmental taxes currently employed in the UK as a solution to these environmental problems. For example, in the UK we have congestion charges, fuel duty, vehicle excise duty and toll roads, to name a few. However, the fact that UK emissions are not decreasing overall suggests that more needs to be done to address these environmental problems. Transport demand is a derived demand. So this is our first main paragraph of point, analyze, chains of analysis, and evaluate and link. You can see that I've missed out the diagrams here, but I've put down what the diagrams actually were. So this means it's demand as a result of wanting another good or service rather than purely for the service itself. Transport demand is also considered a normal good. This means as income increases, demand for goods increases, and therefore so does demand for transport. Fossil fuels are a demerit good. This means they are over-allocated in the free market due to lack of perfect information about the costs of consumption, and they produce large negative externalities, which in this case are emissions. Market failure diagram, which was a negative production externality diagram. The candidate had then gone on to actually impose a tax and look at the way in which the tax could then help to correct the market failure. Okay, so as you can see from the diagram, marginal social cost exceeds marginal private cost, indicating the existence of an externality, which is market failure. The government wants to operate at the social optimal level of output where social welfare is optimal. However, the economy is currently operating in the market equilibrium, leading to a deadweight welfare loss to society as indicated by the shaded triangle. An environmental tax is arguably the best way to eliminate this externality, as it is a form of government intervention. That increases the cost of production and therefore the cost of consuming certain transport. Okay, so you can see the depth and detail of analysis here is really strong. As you can see from the diagram, an environmental tax increases the cost of production from S to S plus tax, therefore acting as a disincentive and therefore leaving the economy at the social optimal and eliminating the welfare loss to society. Okay, an example of this in the UK is the Durham congestion charge, which led to an 85% reduction in car use along this road, as well as a result of the London congestion charge. Journey times were 15% faster and cycling increased by 30%. This is evidence that environmental taxes lead to a reduction in congestion due to increased cost and therefore a reduction in emissions. So excellent examples provided by the candidate there, showing good research and good understanding of the key concepts and the theoretical principles. However, you could argue that environmental taxes aren't always the best solution. This is because transport, particularly cars, are an inelastic good. This means a change in price has very little impact on the quantity demanded, and therefore a tax may be ineffective. For example, in the UK, despite there being a number of taxes that affect cars, e.g. vehicle excise duty, fuel duty and congestion charging, car use is still the most popular form of transport at 64% of UK total transport. Again, really good research use showing that environmental tax isn't the most effective method. So you can see the candidate is really weighing up the pros and cons of actually utilising the method that has been suggested here. As well, in terms of road, it is difficult to tax as it is a quasi-public good, meaning there are non-revealed preferences. Again, really good theoretical understanding. So it is difficult to work out how much consumers value road use. As well, in the UK, there is passenger duty for aviation as an attempt to combat environmental problems. However, 20% of emissions come from aviation, and the aviation journeys continue to increase in the UK, 1% from 2014. Showing that environmental tax is ineffective. Okay, so now the candidate looks at another possible alternative. Again, just looking at what this best way is to actually solve these environmental problems. You can see the focus on the question, answering the question, is excellent. A better alternative could be the use of alternative funds to combat environmental problems. Biofuels are an example of an alternative fuel and are made from waste, and therefore reduce the amount of waste as well as the amount of emissions, so that, for example, the UK can make progress towards reducing its emissions by 80% by 2050 from 1990 levels. Currently in the UK, 5% of petrol is from biofuels, showing that the UK is making some progress in reducing emissions, but not much, or still only 6% of transport is powered by renewables compared to 65% in Norway. The problem with biofuels is there is a large amount of emissions in the production of it, as well as there is an opportunity cost of the land which could have been used for a better purpose, e.g. for planting crops. Again, really good analysis, okay, just weighing up all the ups and the downs of these proposals, okay. So therefore, electricity may be a better alternative. E.g. electric car sales have jumped 21.5% each year in the UK, showing their increasing popularity. However, they still only make up 1.4% of total road vehicles. The government is making some progress in electrifying railways, e.g. with the Transpennine route and HS2 to be electric railways, although still only 40% of rail is electrified in the UK compared to 100% in Switzerland. Again, really good grasp of the research that is expected at this high level. The problem with electric cars is there are a larger amount of emissions released in their production than is the case with petrol or diesel cars, therefore not completely reducing the emissions. Again, the candidate is really weighing up the alternatives and the pros and the cons that they offer. Another problem with alternative energy is it only really combats emissions. It has no effect on, for example, congestion, so it's not the most effective method in dealing with environmental problems. You could argue instead that technology and social trends will most contribute to a reduction in environmental problems. For example, urban mass transit is becoming increasingly popular, which leads to an increase in demand for public transport. In the UK, rail travel has increased 60% since 1990 levels. As well, the peak car hypothesis is a theory that the UK has reached a peak in demand for cars, and demand is slowly starting to level off or even decline. So again, the candidates got this excellent grasp of economic theoretical principles and research that is clearly evident throughout this. Therefore, in cooperation with technological advances which bring about increased fuel efficiency and lower costs of alternatives, there will be progress made to reducing environmental problems. For example, in Denmark, after the Bike Busters scheme, there was a 47% reduction in car use, and 55% of participants continued using bikes after the trial. This shows that as a result of social trends, there can be a modal shift to less emitting vehicles. However, a current trend is the low oil prices. They were very low at 2016, remember. They are half of what they were 3 years ago. This is a major obstacle to reducing environmental damage, as particularly is the case with freight, that transport modes are purely determined by cost factors. So there's almost a good understanding here, an implicit understanding of cross elasticity of demand here. Okay, so therefore, as oil is so cheap, the most emitting modes of transport, e.g. heavy goods vehicles whose emissions per passenger per kilometre are more widely used than less emitting modes of transport such as rail, whose emissions per passenger per kilometre are much lower. However, in the UK, only 9% of freight is transported by rail compared to 74% by road. As well as that, public transport fares increased by twice as much as the cost of driving in the past 10 years. Therefore, there is no incentive for freight nor passengers to switch to lower emitting modes. Okay, so the candidate then considers another diagram, which is just an aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and considers a shift of the long run aggregate supply curve. Let's just look at this. As well, you could argue that environmental taxes have a positive impact on the economy overall. This is because if it is a hypothecated tax, which means revenue is reinvested in that area as the London congestion charges, this can have economic benefits. Again, really good understanding of research and terminology that's very relevant in this field. That term hypothecated tax and being able to utilize that is a very nice one. Okay, and gives a good definition as to what it actually means to really show off that understanding. As you can see from the diagram, the increased investment back into the transport sector has led to an increase in the productive potential of the economy. As you can see from the shift from LRAS to LRAS1, leading to a decrease in inflation from P to P1 and an increase in real GDP. So now the candidate rounds this all off with a very long, sustained judgment. So again, the structure of this essay is excellent, with roughly 4 key areas of analysis and evaluation. So judgments included throughout, and then an excellent judgment at the end. Overall, economic theory would suggest that alone environmental tax is not the best solution to environmental problems. This is because some taxes have no impact evident from the number of car-related taxes. Yet 54% of emissions are still from cars in the UK. As well, I would argue the current aviation tax in the UK that charges the passenger rather than the vehicle or the fuel is ineffective. So good judgments being made in the candidate's own opinion there. This is because they are only taxed based on short haul or long haul flights, which does not reflect the true cost of pollution on the environment, as the taxes have not made a difference to aviation journeys. In fact, 2015 was the strongest year for passenger journeys in the UK since records began. Okay, so the candidate has now justified their opinion very well. Therefore, I would argue that a combination of environmental tax and alternative fuels would be the most effective method. This is because both efficiency and congestion would be reduced as a result, but more importantly, emissions would be reduced. Emissions are the biggest problem facing the UK, as emissions have only reduced by 35% in 2014, when the target is 80% by 2050, showing that it is a difficult problem to combat due to increased demand for transport. However, the biggest obstacle to effective tax is knowing how much to tax and which modes to tax. I'd argue in the UK that fuel duty needs to be higher for all modes of transport, and as previously mentioned, a more intelligent aviation tax system is required. As well, I'd say the biggest obstacle to alternative fuels is the low fuel price. Although this affects freight transport more than passenger transport, or only makes up a third of emissions, yet it is important to address this as freight emissions are continuing to grow, whereas passenger emissions are not. Finally, I'd argue that the environmental problems caused by transport shouldn't be the biggest concern, because transport only accounts for a fifth of total emissions, and therefore we shouldn't instead be addressing other sectors such as the agricultural sector in order to reduce overall emissions and keep the global temperature to as little as possible above 2 degrees centigrade within that margin, of course, the candidate is implying, really. Okay, so it's a fab essay. It really is. Excellent essay. I hope that's been useful for those of you following the transport and the environment theme. Do let me know your thoughts on that. Thanks